Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture Crop Talk webinar series. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Manitoba Agriculture YouTube channel shortly after broadcast. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to Crop Talk for September the 4th. And with today's Crop Talk, I was thinking about a few things to go through. Start with a crop update. There's been a fair bit of moisture over the past week or so here, so a lot of the harvest is slowing down, but I thought we'd go through a little bit of crop update, see where most of the crops are sitting at this point, and from there we'll go into a little bit of information I put together on grain aeration. I've been getting a fair bit of questions lately on aeration systems, just what we should be looking for, how we should be managing them. So I was able to put a few things together to kind of help explain a bit of that. It's not going to be the definite Bible on aeration, but it'll give you a few points and a few information sources to look at when you're looking at aerating grain down. And I think with some of the wet conditions here, I think a lot of people are really looking at aeration right now and grain drying. From that, temperatures have been cooling off, and we've been getting down in a lot of areas too and close to frost situations. So I thought I'd maybe jump the gun a little bit here and talk a little bit about frost damage and what to look for in case we do get a frost event over the next little while here. And maybe by doing this, we'll be able to hold off the frost and not actually have an event. But I thought I'd just put a few of the pointers up as to what to look for in case we do get a frost event and how to kind of manage them from there on. So like usual, I'd like to put up the Manitoba crop weather report for the past 8 days, and then, again for the whole season. And as you can see, over the past 8 days, there's been pretty much rainfall throughout the whole Southwest and the majority of the province actually, and creating some fairly wet conditions in some areas. I have been asked a couple of questions regarding some of them. I know some reports of amounts of rain higher than actual recordings here, and I think we've been getting some heavy showers that have been going through that may not be hitting all the weather stations the same amount as they're hitting some of the areas. So definitely there are some areas from talking to producers that are getting a little bit more rain than might be recorded here. But again, I think in general right now most producers are in kind of a wet condition right now. The soil situations have definitely got to the point where we are needing it to dry up a little bit before we get any more rainfall, because it's starting to actually accumulate in fields in some areas throughout the Southwest. Being that said, they're also talking about more rainfall later on today and then through the weekend, maybe some as well. So hopefully we can skirt that one and maybe not get as much as they're forecasting. But again, wet conditions seem to be something that is carrying on. I guess the other thing just to notice from there is our average temperatures, and we're definitely not getting the heat that we require for some of the crops to come in, and you can really notice that in our growing degree days. When you look at some of the areas, right in that 1200 growing degree days and percent of normal, anywhere from the high 80s to the low 90s sort of range. So we're definitely falling behind there. And one of the things about that is we're getting into that time of year where we're experiencing longer, or the evenings are starting to get longer, and the amount of time that we're going to get a lot of the heat is actually the window is narrowing down on us. So we're probably getting into that window where the heat units are going to be actually starting to slow down for us. So it would be good to get a little bit of a heat wave come through here and help bring in some of those crops. There still is a fair few crops that are fairly late out there and are needing, some time yet before we get any type of fall frost. Looking at moisture wise, I think right now we're probably, if anything, we're normal, and some areas again are above normal, but the majority of the areas have reached normal. And again, there's the Lake Audie area is still only about 70%. So there's still some areas throughout the southwest that are dry, but there's also some areas through the eastern part of the region that are dry as well. Talked a bit about growing degree days on the previous slide, and just wanted to show you this one. And this one, I got this one out of from the Saskatchewan website, and it shows for northeastern Saskatchewan, so basically right along the Manitoba border here. And when you look at the growing degree days for the long-term average, we would be just under the 14, probably about the 1300 range. And then when you look at where we're sitting this year, right now we're right around the 1200 range. So definitely below our normal heat units and our growing degree days. So definitely telling us why some of these crops are hanging on and not maturing as quick as they should be. So a little bit of a crop update. Some harvest has started, and regarding cereal crops, we're probably about 30% complete in the southwest here. Wheat that has been harvested right now is pretty good. The yields are anywhere between 60 and 80 range with good quality. I think the biggest thing with wheat again this year is our protein levels seem to be jumping all over the place. I've been hearing as low as 11.5 range, and then I'm hearing as high as 14 to 15 range. So again, I think it's depending on your area and depending on the moisture you receive through the growing season. If you're a little on the dry side, your protein might be a little bit higher, but your yields might be a little bit lower. And then I've been talking to some guys that are in the higher side of the yield range that their protein levels are a little bit lower. So received a little bit more moisture in those areas, and definitely got the yield, but the effects of the protein is there. Barley, probably one of the crops that's been the most consistently harvested throughout the southwest here. We've got right from as far north as Riding Mountain Park to down to the U.S. border, where a lot of the barley has been harvested. There's still some out there, but right now the yields look to be above average in most cases, with really good quality and test weights. I'm hearing reports of anywhere between 80 and 100 bushels an acre, at some cases even a little bit higher. So the barley crop has come off fairly well this year. Oats, again, not a lot of producers have done oats yet. There's been some put in the bin. Again, yields I think are going to be around average this year. I've heard some yields of the 120 bushel range and even higher, with good quality and good test weight. So again, right around the average of what we've been experiencing over the last few years, and good quality. I think some of the issues that we're running into right now with some of the cereal crops, especially any barley and oats that is still standing. I've been getting calls from producers regarding the crop breaking down quite severely and shelling with the recent rains and the winds we've been getting. So I think producers are looking at this, and in some cases reluctantly looking at swathing some of those crops to try to get them down and get them at least in a situation where they won't shell as much anymore. I guess the only problem with that, with the rainfalls we've been getting, we're probably going to be losing some quality in those grains fairly quickly as things try to dry down here. Canola, crop that has been kind of all over the board right from spring, and I think it's carried right through into fall here, where the crop in general looks to be average. I don't think we're going to be seeing the yields that we've seen in the last couple of years. I think talking to some producers that have done some harvest, I'm hearing some 40s, some 45 bushel ranges. So definitely not as high as we've seen in previous years. And you could see that when you were out in the fields. The top pods, especially during that mid to late part of July, never did flower for very long, and sometimes those pods aborted without even or those flowers aborted without even producing pods. So in general, you know, the crop is just not as good as it's been in the previous year, and you can even see that with the size of pods that are out there as well. Regarding disease-wise, I'm starting to see some sclerotinia showing up in the later seeded crops, and I'm not sure if it's because maybe some of those crops weren't sprayed for disease, but sclerotinia is showing up in those crops, and not bad, but it's definitely easy to find in those fields. Black leg levels, I don't think are any worse than every other year, and I would say probably right about average. From the guys that have done some harvest, the quality looks good, but the other comment I've been getting is some of the seed is a little on the smaller side compared to previous years. And again, I would probably say that that's a little bit more due to the heat situation and the dry conditions, where a lot of those pods just weren't able to fill as good as they normally would have filled. We have had some frost issues in the southwest here. And when you go, especially north of Highway 45 into that Angusville area, Russell, north of Russell area, there has been some spotting of the pods and some issues with a touch of frost. I don't think the damage has been severe. Just in talking to producers, they're noticing it when they're out there in the field doing some swathing right now. Regarding swathing, which is kind of interesting, I've been finding and seeing over the last week to 10 days a lot of canola fields being swathed. And probably when you look at the amount of seed that was bought that was pod shatter, and you would have been thinking that a lot of those fields would have been left standing for straight cutting, it made you wonder why you're seeing all these fields swathed. So I started talking to some producers, and been given a couple of reasons why they're looking at swathing. I think the big one is time-wise. I think a lot of them right now, the combines are standing, and they have the ability to go out there and swath some of this canola. So they're looking at time and using some of this time right now where they can get that crop swathed. So when they get into cereal crops later on, that canola will be drying in the swath, and once they're done harvesting cereal crops, that canola will be ready to be able to combine. Another comment one producer said was that when things do turn around, they're going to be able to straight cut cereals in the day. When it gets too tough to be straight cutting cereals, they'll drop the headers and go pick up canola swaths and be able to go later at night. And I think that's one thing that I mentioned earlier on with the weather conditions and the days getting shorter, and 9 o'clock sun going down. We're going to be in a situation with the rains we've been getting is things are going to get fairly tough fairly fast in the evenings, and they stay fairly wet in the morning. So again, just a strategy wise by some producers as to maybe getting longer harvest days in when conditions do turn around for them to get back out into the field. Soybeans. I guess we got to the point on soybeans now where we don't need a rain anymore to help finish them off. You look at a lot of the soybean fields, they're starting to yellow. We're starting to get leaf drop. I think basically now we just need the time for those pods that are there to ripen in and mature. So again, the rainfall requirement for them to finish filling is pretty much done. Now it's just a time for them to dry up and get ready for harvest. One of the things I have been noticing is I'm seeing a lot of seed pods with 2s and 3s in them this year as compared to previous years. We were seeing a lot of 3s and 4s. So not saying that we're going to get below average yields, but just that we're probably going to get yields similar to last year. I think last year we've seen the same thing happening a little bit later on in the growing season, where we didn't get some of the rainfall and some of these top pods just didn't get a chance to fill. And you can see by these pictures here that I took yesterday in a soybean field where top pods, leaves are turning, leaves are falling, and the top pods are basically not filling and not going to, contribute to the bushels at harvest time. So again, similar to canola, just, crop was a little bit too dry, and just rains came a little bit too late to help these pods finish up. Sunflowers, one of the crops that seems to be doing really well this year. It's a crop that requires a fair bit of moisture, but boy, are you seeing some nice size heads. Plants were able to scavenge for the moisture, I think, and were able to get down there really deep for that moisture and continue growing during the dry conditions. And again, just a crop that was going to require a few more days of heat to bring it in. But right now, potential there is for probably average to above average yields, I would think, for most guys growing sunflowers. Corn, right now looks to be average. You can see where the dry conditions, especially on the earlier corn, I classify this as earlier corn right now because I've seen a lot of corn that isn't quite this ripe yet. And you can see at the top of the cob where just didn't produce viable seed. And, again, just needed a rainfall on some of the earlier crop to help get that filled. And, I guess the earlier crop is going to have the advantage now because it is actually starting to ripen in as compared to some of the later seeded corn crops where we're seeing a lot of the cobs still not quite this far advanced. And, I would say those ones are, in general, we're about 2 weeks behind normal. But if you look at some of those other cobs that are still not at this stage, they're probably closer to 3 weeks behind normal. And I guess the saving grace for most of it in the as you get a little bit farther north in the region, it's the majority of it is going to be for silage. And when you get south of number 1 highway, south of number 2 highway, there's a lot of grain corn down in that country, and it's probably in this stage right here where, and in some cases maybe a little bit farther advanced too. So again, grain corn just needing, a couple more weeks, and we can get to the point where some of this corn will be, out of too much danger of a frost. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grain aeration now, and just again, a main reason is I've been starting to get some questions from producers as to where they can get information on aeration and just how to go about even managing the aeration. So I guess the biggest thing with aeration is it's a tool to use, when you got the potential for grain spoiling, that either too hot or too wet. So it could be, I don't think we're going to be in a situation where the grain will be too hot right now, but we'll be more in a situation of the grain being too wet. And but this way the aeration will help you manage that and prevent grain from spoiling. So when you look at aeration, basically you're looking at air flowing through the grain and air flowing through the grain provided by a fan. So either you'll do two things with that fan. You'll either get the grain to stay in the condition that it is or cool it down, and or in some cases, depending on your fan and your bin, you might get some grain drying as well. So really with the airflow, it depends on on your static pressure in your bin. So your fan is blowing the air through and into the bin, and then you got resistance in the bin from all the grain that you've put in there. So if you can get that air blowing through the bin and up through the grain, then that's your ability to either cool or dry the grain. And the resistance to that airflow is basically the grain. So basically this comment, it's all about airflow rate, aeration. You can keep the grain or cool the grain. In those conditions, you need a low airflow rate. So, you know, anywhere from 0.1 to 0.2 cubic feet per minute per bushel, and you will have a fan that is strong enough to, I guess, keep the grain and help you manage the grain over a certain period of time. If you're looking at something more than that, so let's just say that you're in a situation where you're going to be pulling off a lot of high moisture grain, and you're wondering about you know, doing something to let's say dry the grain. If you're looking at drying grain or actually removing the moisture, you're going to need a fairly high rate of airflow through the grain, and that's going to be anywhere from 1 to 2 cubic feet per minute per bushel. So basic concept there, cooling the grain and keeping the grain. You don't need as large a fan. If you're looking at drying grain, you're going to need more airflow through that grain, and in order to get that, you're going to need a bigger fan. One of the things that it kind of comes down to is your equilibrium moisture content. And what that is it depends on your air temperature, your relative humidity, and your grain type. For every temperature and relative humidity combination, air has a specific equilibrium moisture that it'll reach. And at that point where the moisture in the air and the grain kind of reached a steady rate, and basically the air won't be taking any more moisture out of the grain and or adding moisture to the grain. So it's kind of formed an equilibrium, so it'll stay constant. So they've actually created charts for this. So so you would actually know where you're kind of sitting when you are looking at aerating grain. So for example, if the air has a relative humidity of 50%, so that would be the line across the top here, and the temperature of the grain is determined from the side here. So in this example, the relative humidity is 50%, and the temperature outside is 5%, 5 degrees Celsius. Its equilibrium measurement for wheat is 13.1. So let's just say that the temperature outside is 5, the relative humidity is 50. If you go across, eventually that bin will equilibrium out to 13.1 moisture. So whether the wheat started there at 8% moisture or started there at 14% moisture, if you leave that fan running and it keeps pushing moisture or pushing air through that bin at this humidity and this temperature, that's the moisture you'll land up at is 13.1. So you can use this chart to look at several different scenarios, and for when you do get the grain in the bin and you're starting to aerate it down. And here's just a couple more of the charts that are there. One for barley, one for peas, and they'll all be, the biggest thing there is it all depends on your grain size and the ability of the air to move through the grain as to how your equilibrium will change. So peas being something where air moves very fast, you can see that a lot of the numbers it'll dry down fairly fast. And here's canola and oats. So how do grain conditions affect the air capacity to dry? So if you have warm air and you have warm grain, you'll actually get drying of the grain. If you have warm air and cool grain, you'll get wetting, because the warm air will cause the grain to warm up. Warms up, it starts sweating, you're going to get wet, you're actually wetting the grain. Cool air and warm grain, what you can do there is by moving in cool air into the warm grain, you'll get some quick short-term drying. And what that's doing is, because it's bringing the temperature of the grain down, it's basically can bring the moisture down, but that's not long-term, because the moisture, if let's say that you shut your fan off, the grain will warm up again, and then that moisture will come back. If you have cool air and cool grain, you're going to see no change. So as we get later in the fall here, the grain temperature isn't going to be as warm. The air temperature is going to be colder. So basically what you're doing is you're just keeping things. So when you look at the comments below here, and when is the best time to run your fans, because that's probably the biggest question I've been getting, is what is, depending on what you're looking at doing, if you want to store your grain and make sure it's safe, depending on all conditions, basically once you start dumping grain in the bin, once you've covered your floor, or once you've got it to the point where you've got a layer there where the air can blow through, run your fans continuously. Now, running fans continuously can get fairly expensive, so a lot of people are looking at, well, do I need to run them all the time? If the grain is only 1 or 2% moisture above dry, run the fans at night only. And so you've got wet grain, but you're throwing cool air onto it, and you might get that odd short-term drying there. And by running cool air through it, which will be your night hours, you'll be able to keep it, or in some cases you might even bring it down a percentage or so, depending on the relative humidity outside. If your grain is more than 1 or 2% above dry, run fans during the day only. And because usually what will happen, and again, depending on the temperature of the grain, you might get that grain to dry down, or at least you're putting warmer air through there to try to bring that grain moisture down. If you get to the point where you've over dried your grain, so because what happens with grain is because you're blowing air into the bottom of the bin, what usually happens is the bottom of the bin will dry first, and the moisture layer goes up through the bin to the top. So when you go to check the bin, you'll feel the top at the bin, there's really lots of high humidity up there, and a lot of times the top of the bin will stay wetter, or will be wetter than the bottom of the bin. If you get it to the point where you've got the bin over dry, let's say you're down to 12% moisture, what you could do is you could run the fan during the day only, or run the fan at night, depending on what you want to do to bring up that moisture of the grain. Of course, I don't think that's going to be an issue for this year. I think the biggest issue this year is going to be for the short term is keeping the grain, because I know a lot of producers right now that have been taking off 20 to 20+% moisture grain, grain that probably needs to be dried and by some method of using propane. So in that case, a lot of the aeration bins are going to be meant for keeping grain and till they can get to the dryer. Found these charts as well and thought they'd be interesting to have. It's the number of safe storage days, and this is for wheat. And so if you look at your grain temperature, and if your grain temperature, let's say, is 20 degrees Celsius, and your moisture is right around the, let's say 18, you can keep it for 20 to 30 days without anything without doing anything to the grain. So basically not even having it on aeration. The numbers show that 20 degrees Celsius at 18% moisture, you got about 3 weeks before you need to be doing something with that grain, before something starts to happen in that bin that's going to affect the quality. Now, again, make sure you know the moisture, because there's a big difference between 17% moisture and 18% moisture when you look at this chart. So when you're putting the grain in the bin, make sure you're sampling properly and make sure that you have a good average sample when you determine what the moisture is, because again, and always monitoring the bins, because if you're along this line here, you know that you're playing with fire if you go past those days, right? And another one with canola, and as we get later into harvest this year, I can see where we'll, depending on the weather conditions and hoping things are going to change. But if we're in a situation where we're looking at putting in some higher moisture canola into the bin, if you're looking at something where you're at, that 12 to 14 range, you're looking at, the most about, 20 days sort of thing before you need to be concerned about, what's happening. Again, higher the temperature, the shorter the time period you can leave the grain, and which makes sense because warmer grain is going to heat faster than cooler grain, and that's where the advantage of using an aeration or some type of aeration equipment, because if you can blow cool air or cool the grain down to 10 degrees by blowing cold air into it, your amount of days you're able to keep that grain without spoilage increases quite a bit. Okay, I'm going to leave aeration right now and go to how to identify frost damage, and in case we do get some frost issues over the next little while here, as to what we might be looking at or seeing in the field. And I think some producers north of 45 highway in the Russell, again, Angusville area have been seeing a little bit of this already. And this is just a picture of some frosted canola pods, and you can see the white speckling on the pod. Again, this was taken a few days after the frost, so probably not going to do a lot of damage. But again, just the first visual effects of what frost damage looks like on the pods. So when you're looking at canola, there's the biggest question all the time is how bad was the frost, how cold was the frost, how long a time period did the frost go over. And I think the biggest thing it always is, I guess, depending on where you are, but it's how cold it got. -5 and below is probably going to do a lot of damage. And what happens then is ice crystals form inside the kernels and basically disrupt the membranes, and you'll get immature canola, and so at that temperature you're going to see a fair bit of damage. -2 degrees Celsius, pods will turn white and wilt soon after. You probably see some pod shattering and dropping. That's again something where if we get something like the -2s to the -5s, you really need to start monitoring your fields and seeing if there's going to be any pod breaking and shattering, because that crop will need to be swathed as quick as you can in order to save what's there. The light frost, the 0 to -2, is what the first picture was showing, and you've seen some speckling on the stems and the pods. And in most cases so far, I don't think we've seen any kind of damage or any kind of frost that's going to do any kind of major damage so far. So I know frost like this one so far is something that's is going to be okay and not do any major seed quality issues there at all. for soybeans, probably another crop out there right now that has been affected by the our growing degree days and is kind of hanging on and hanging on. You know, so depending on the staging, frost during an R5 can reduce yields by, you know, anywhere from 50 to 70%. Now, most cases we are past the R5, and I think we're probably more in the R6 to R7 stages right now on most fields. So again, there, you know, you can expect yields in the R6 of a, you know, 20 to 30% loss, R7s at about 5%. And then once you get into the point where at R8s, basically you're physically mature and you're not going to see any damage at all. Another problem that we're seeing with soybeans this year and canola, probably more in canola than in soybeans even, is the very unevenness of the crop. And that's where we might run into some problems when we're trying to determine how much damage, and actually even trying to keep the quality of our sample there, because we'll have areas in the field that might be greener and might show damage more than other areas of the field. So again, probably the best thing to do is, if we do get a situation, is to get out in your field and assess where the damage has occurred, and maybe we could do some things where we can maybe cut some areas out. Sunflowers, a lot of the sunflowers I think are doing pretty good right now, and I will need a fairly cold frost to do damage, because with sunflowers it's a little bit different. The frost needs to penetrate the back of the head and in order to do a lot of damage to the seed. And right now we've got some fairly well developed seeds already in the plant, so you know, I think you know, it would have to be a major frost event right now to affect the sunflowers. So not as big a concern with the fields I've been seeing so far anyways. Corn is probably the biggest one right now. With corn, there's a couple things you can do to kind of judge which stage you're at. When you go and pick some cobs, sorry, and look at the grain, you'll see that if you open up a cob and look at the seeds, if there's a layer of black, you're looking for the black layer here, and that's telling you that your seed is fairly mature already, and we're not that there on several of the acres I've been in. We're probably more into these areas here. When you see this black layer, you're probably around 30% moisture. 30% moisture is probably the stage you want to be before you'll see any major yield loss from corn. And this is what we're seeing right now out in the field. So when you're looking for that black layer, fairly hard to, sorry, you're not seeing it at all. You know, with a lot of the corn being put up for silage, especially when you get north of number 1 highway, you're going to want to watch the milk line. So the milk line is when you see the turning of the seed from the whitish color to the yellow color. You can see the milk line. It's kind of forming here. It's not well developed yet, but you know, you want that milk line to be about 2/3 of the kernel when you're putting it up for silage. So again, we've got a fair bit of time before this would be even ready for silaging. And you know, when we're looking at silaging, we're looking at you know 60% moisture, maybe a little bit higher. So definitely a big difference between silage and grain corn. So I guess the big thing with silage is, even though we may not, if we did get an early frost event, we haven't lost the actual nutrients. We lost the actual value of the seed, which is important, because the seed is what's going to help in giving making really good feed quality, but there's still going to be feed value there, but a lot of it'll be left in the stalk and the cob that is there. And what you want to do is don't panic. A lot of times people will say right after the frost, I need to get out and do my silage right away. I think the big thing you want to do there is you want to make sure your moisture levels are right, because a light frost you may lose your leaves, but there'll still be a lot of moisture in that stalk and cob, and you could be too high in moisture. So you want to make sure your moisture levels are still there in order to put up good quality, or I should say, put up the feed in the quality that's left, and that you're able to store and make feed out of it. So grain corn, look for the black layer. If the black layer is there, fine. If not, you're going to start seeing yield reductions. Yield reductions are going to depend on staging. Corn is denting. You're probably looking at, with an early frost, about a 30% yield loss. But silage corn, again, the biggest thing is you're going to lose some of the quality as compared to the bulk is probably still going to be there, but it's just not going to be as good a quality because of lack of seed in the pile. I guess with that, that's all I had for today. Wanted to go over a few of those things. Once again, I want to remind everyone that the seasonal crop reports are still being put up on the website. Growing conditions, insect, weed, and disease reports are going up. I know we're getting to a time of year when those probably aren't going to be changing a lot. The weather maps are still up there, so if we do get a frost event, it'll be fairly easy for you to go to your location and find out when it started to freeze and for how many hours it did freeze. I think the big thing too is we're still in a situation in the province where we're having some areas that are definitely short of feed. So if you've got extra feed and are looking at marketing it, there's our Manitoba hay listing. So please put your information on there. Also, if you have straw, I think that's something that can go on there as well. And then for those producers that are looking at facing a shortage of feed, there's a lot of good stuff on our website to help you figure out the amount of feed you need and look at the quality of feed you have and to make a ration for yourself. Again, if you've got questions, here's the extension specialist in the province here, so feel free to contact these people at any time. And with the mornings getting cold, we'll hopefully not see any frost, and join us next week, September 11th, for the next edition of Crop Talk.